The sun bled out across the horizon of Red Mesa County, painting the vast, indifferent sky in hues of bruised purple and fiery orange. In the Arizona Territory of 1890, twilight did not fall gently. It was a final, violent spectacle before the cold and the dark took hold. The wind, a constant, lonely traveler in this land, swept across the plains, carrying with it the fine red dust that settled on everything, a permanent stain of the earth. It whispered through the sagebrush and rattled a strange wind chime hanging from the porch of a solitary ranch house, a string of spent brass shell casings that clinked together with a sound that was half music, half warning. This was Half Moonwash, a place named for a curve in a dry riverbed, a place where a man could disappear and the world would be slow to notice. The daily stagecoach, a lumbering beast of wood and leather, seemed to groan in protest as it pulled to a halt, its wheels sinking into the dust. From its confines emerged a single passenger, a woman who looked as weary as the landscape itself, yet held a spark in her eyes that the harsh sun had not managed to extinguish. Marigold Vance, who went by Goldie, was 28, though the lines of worry around her eyes and the set of her jaw made her seem older. Her dress of plain, homespun cotton was faded from sun and repeated washings, frayed at the hem from miles of walking on unforgiving ground. She clutched a canvas satchel to her side as if it were a shield. Inside was the sum of her worldly possessions, a worn leather-bound notebook filled with a neat, precise script, a few sticks of charcoal, and a letter, its edges blackened and brittle, a relic of a life that had been burned away. She took a deep breath, the air dry and tasting of dust and the faint, wild scent of creosote. This was it, the end of the line, and perhaps a new beginning. He appeared not from the house, but from the land itself. Emerging from a cluster of Palo Verde trees near the corral, he moved with a quiet economy of motion, a man who wasted nothing, not words, not steps, not emotions. This was Sawyer Hale. His face was a map of the territory, weathered and unreadable, shadowed by the brim of a battered straw hat. A cracked leather duster hung on his tall, lean frame, and his eyes, the color of slate, held a stillness that was unnerving. They missed nothing. He was not alone. Around him moved a small herd of horses, a motley collection of breeds and colors. They were not the sleek, powerful animals of a prosperous ranch. They were scrawny, scarred, and nervous, but they stuck close to him, their ears swiveling to track his every move. They were the orphans of the plains, the survivors of sandstorms and droughts, and he was their silent protector. Goldie straightened her spine, a small, defiant gesture against the weariness that pulled at her shoulders. She walked towards him, her worn boots making soft puffs in the red dirt. The horses shied away slightly, forming a protective crescent behind him. "Mr. Hale?" she asked, her voice clearer and stronger than he might have expected. "My name is Marigold Vance. The station master in Dust Devil Fork said you might have need of a hand." Sawyer's gaze swept over her, taking in the frayed dress, the determined set of her chin, the intelligence in her bright, hazel eyes. He said nothing. His silence was a physical thing, a wall that few people ever tried to climb. Goldie pressed on, her words practiced, honed by desperation. "I'm a traveling scribe, a teacher. I can keep your books, write letters, teach letters to any children in the vicinity. I'm a hard worker and I require only simple room and board until I can find more permanent employment." She left out the reason she was so desperate, the part about being run out of Kestrel Bend, framed and disgraced. The charred letter in her bag was the only proof of her innocence, and it was too damaged to convince anyone who wasn't already willing to believe. As the silence stretched, a sound cracked through the twilight. Calm. The sharp report of a rifle, distant but clear. Goldie flinched, her hand instinctively going to her satchel. Sawyer didn't move a muscle, save for a slight tilt of his head. His eyes were distant, focused on something only he could see. He was listening, not just to the sound, but to the echo that followed. 1, 2, 3. The seconds ticked by in his mind, a familiar calculation. He was measuring the distance, gauging the threat. It was the ingrained habit of a man who had survived flash floods, cattle rustlers, and the long, slow violence of starvation. The land had taught him that survival was a matter of mathematics and vigilance. Before Goldie could ask, the source of the gunshot announced itself. 3 riders crested the low rise to the east, their figures silhouetted against the dying sun. They moved with a swaggering confidence that spoke of men who took what they wanted without asking. The man in the lead was stout, dressed in a city suit that looked out of place and uncomfortable in the heat. A silver watch chain was stretched taut across his vest. This was Silas Crow, a man whose smile never reached his cold, porcine eyes. He represented the railroad, and by extension, the relentless, devouring march of progress. They reined in their horses a few yards from the porch, the animals stomping and blowing impatiently. Crow's gaze dismissed Goldie entirely, fixing on Sawyer with a look of predatory amusement. One of his hired hands, a lanky man with a cruel twist to his mouth, unrolled a piece of paper. "Hail," Crow said, his voice a gravelly rumble. "Your time is up." With a flick of his wrist, he sent the paper sailing through the air. It fluttered and landed on the dusty porch boards. A foreclosure notice. Sawyer's eyes dropped to the document, his expression unchanging. He didn't move to pick it up. Goldie, however, did. She stepped forward, her curiosity overriding her caution. Her eyes scanned the legal text, the dense blocks of print that had the power to unmake a man's life. Her finger traced a line, stopping on a particular phrase, Scrip Homestead 47B, and beneath it, a signature Sawyer Hale, written in a hand that was too neat, too fluid for a man like the one standing before her. Then she saw the official seal pressed into the paper, an ornate eagle clutching a bundle of arrows. It was almost perfect. Almost. Sawyer finally moved. He stepped onto the porch, bent down, and picked up the notice. He looked at it for a long moment. Then, with a quiet deliberation, he ripped it precisely in half and let the pieces fall to the ground. It was a small act of defiance, but it was enough. As the 2 halves of the notice settled in the dust, Goldie, shielded by Sawyer's body, knelt down with a piece of charcoal from her satchel. She quickly, deftly sketched the seal from memory into her notebook, capturing its every detail. Crow let out a short, ugly laugh. "That won't change anything. Hale, the law is the law." His eyes then shifted, and for the first time, he truly saw Goldie. A flicker of recognition crossed his face, followed by a look of profound, malicious satisfaction. He had her cornered, far from anyone who might help her. Well, he purred, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "Miss Vance, I see you landed on your feet. Or have you?" He leaned forward in his saddle, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial rasp that made Goldie's skin crawl. He was speaking of Kestrel Bend, where she had worked as a clerk, where she had discovered his meticulous scheme of falsifying ledgers and defrauding the very railroad he worked for, where he had turned the tables on her, branding her a thief to cover his own tracks. "Haven't you learned your lesson yet?" Crow's voice was low, but it carried in the still air, a clear and chilling threat. Some books are best left closed. Sawyer remained still, his back to Goldie, a silent shield between her and the man who had ruined her life. He didn't answer Crow's taunt. He didn't need to. Instead, he made a low sound in his throat and gave a nearly imperceptible tug on a rein he held coiled in his hand. The effect was instantaneous and startling. The orphan herd, which had been milling nervously, responded as one. They moved forward, a silent, disciplined wave of horseflesh, forming a tight wedge with Sawyer at its point. Their bodies created a living wall in front of the porch, their collective presence a formidable, unconventional barrier. There were no bared teeth, no aggressive posturing, but the message was unmistakable. They were protecting their own. The sight was so strange, so unexpected, that Crow's men shifted in their saddles, their horses catching the tension and sidestepping nervously. Even Crow was momentarily taken aback, his sneer faltering. In that brief, charged moment, Goldie saw her chance. She moved close to Sawyer's side, her voice a low, urgent whisper that only he could hear. "Mister, Hale, that document is a fraud. The seal is a forgery, and I suspect the signature is as well. I know the law. I know how men like him operate. I can help you fight this." She took a breath, laying her desperation bare. "In exchange, I ask only for a place to stay, shelter, a chance to work." Sawyer didn't turn his head. His eyes remained fixed on Crow, but Goldie felt his attention shift to her. The air crackled with unspoken questions. He was a man who trusted no one, who relied only on himself and the broken creatures he had saved. And now, a stranger, a woman with her own ghosts, was offering him an alliance. He gave a single, short, decisive nod. It was all the answer she needed. A wave of relief so profound it almost made her knees buckle washed over her. Inside the small ranch house, the fire in the hearth cast a warm, flickering light. As Goldie stepped back from the confrontation, the light caught their silhouettes, merging them into one long, unified shadow on the rough-hewn wooden wall. Crow seemed to sense the shift, the silent agreement that had just been forged. He had lost his advantage for the moment. He gathered his reins, his face a mask of cold fury. He would not be deterred by a lone rancher and a disgraced clerk. He had the power of the railroad behind him, an unstoppable force. He backed his horse away slowly, his eyes locked on Goldie. His final words were not shouted, but spoken in a soft, menacing tone that was far more terrifying. 14 days. Hale. The survey team will be here in 14 days to stake the railroad's claim. This land will belong to us. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. Then his gaze, cold and possessive, settled on Goldie, leaving no doubt as to his meaning. "And so will she, Miss Vance. So will she." The three riders turned and galloped away, their laughter swallowed by the vast, encroaching darkness, leaving behind only the settling red dust and a threat that hung in the air like the promise of a storm. The first morning at Half Moon Wash arrived not with a bang, but with a whisper of cold air that seeped through the cracks in the cabin walls. Goldie was awake before the sun, a habit ingrained from a life of precariousness where wasted daylight was a luxury she could not afford. She sat on the edge of the simple cot Sawyer had prepared for her, a rough wool blanket pulled around her shoulders. The silence was immense, broken only by the sighing of the wind and the distant, rhythmic stamp of a horse's hoof. She picked up the tin cup from the small crate beside her bed and felt the chill of the metal against her lips. A thin film of condensation had formed on the rim. She opened her notebook, the smooth leather cool beneath her fingers, and began to write. Not a diary of feelings, but a catalog of sensations. The cadence of the wind, she noted, was different here than in Kestrel Bend, longer, more mournful. She wrote of the musky, earthy scent of the horses that clung to the air and the faint, irregular jingle of a cowbell from a neighboring homestead. A lonely, intermittent heartbeat in the vast emptiness, drawn by the promise of warmth. She made her way to the small kitchen. A fire was already going in the hearth, its low, steady flames casting dancing shadows on the log walls. A blackened coffee pot bubbled over the heat, filling the small space with a rich, bitter aroma. On the rough-hewn table, Sawyer had left a breakfast for her. It was a simple, almost clumsy offering, a stack of lopsided corn cakes, clearly made by a hand more accustomed to mending harnesses than measuring flour. Beside the plate lay a knife. Its wooden handle was worn smooth and dark with use, its blade sharpened so many times over the years that its shape had been altered, narrowed by the constant friction of the whetstone. The entire scene, the functional meal. The well-used tool spoke of a long, lonely self-sufficiency. It was the mark of a man who had learned to expect nothing from the world and had arranged his life accordingly. Later that morning, as the sun climbed higher, casting a harsh white light over the land, two small figures appeared, walking up the long track to the ranch. A girl of about 9, with a serious face and sun-bleached braids, and a boy a few years younger, his hair a wild tangle of brown. They were Isla and Pax, the children of a settler family whose small homestead lay a mile down the wash. They came, as they apparently did most days, for water, carrying a wooden bucket between them. while Sawyer worked the hand pump, the rhythmic squeak and splash echoing in the quiet air. Goldie approached the children. She saw the curiosity in their eyes, the shy hunger for something beyond the daily chores of their hardscrabble life. She took a stick and, in the smooth, packed dirt near the porch, drew a large, clear A. "This is the start of everything," she said, her voice soft. "Every word, every story, every law written on a piece of paper begins with a letter like this one." Isla's serious expression broke into a look of wonder. Pax crouched down, his small finger tracing the shape in the dust. For the next hour, Goldie taught them. She drew the alphabet, turning the lesson into a game of shapes and sounds. The sun beat down on them, but in that small patch of dirt, a world of possibility was opening up. Sawyer watched from a distance as he repaired a bridle, his hands busy but his attention fixed on the scene. He saw the gentle patience in Goldie's demeanor, the way she made the children feel clever and important. He saw the light in their eyes, a light he hadn't realized had been missing. There was no cruelty here, no harsh discipline, only a quiet and steady sharing of knowledge. Over the next few days, Goldie began to understand the subtle rhythms of Sawyer's life. He was a man who lived by a strict, unspoken code of conservation. She watched him one afternoon in the lean-to that served as a pantry. He was taking inventory, his hand moving over the sacks of flour, beans, and dried corn. He counted them not with the casual air of a housekeeper, but with the focused intensity of a soldier counting his ammunition before a battle. Every ounce was accounted for, every potential meal measured against the unforgiving calculus of survival. He had faced scarcity before. She realized. It had carved itself into his very bones, teaching him a discipline that bordered on austerity. The ranch house was functional, but sparse. The only decoration on the main room wall was a hand-drawn map of the property, marking the locations of wells, springs, and grazing areas. It was crude. Some of the ink faded and blurred. One afternoon, Goldie decided to improve it, using her own finer charcoal sticks to clarify the lines and add notes. Sawyer needed to hold a corner of the thick paper flush against the wall while she secured it with a small nail. As she reached to tap the nail into place with the butt of the worn knife, the back of her hand brushed against his. It was a small, fleeting contact, skin against skin, but a jolt of unexpected heat shot through her, as sharp and surprising as a spark from a flint. She saw him flinch, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. They both pulled back at the same instant, a sudden, awkward space opening between them. A flush rose on Goldie's cheeks, and she looked down, suddenly fascinated by the grain of the wooden floor. He turned away, busying himself with a piece of tack that didn't need mending. Neither of them spoke a word, but the quiet in the room was now different. It was filled with a new and unsettling awareness. Her practical skills found a use in the barn. A young foal, a gangly creature with impossibly long legs, had strained a tendon. Sawyer was adept at setting bones and stitching wounds, but this was a different kind of injury, one that required a patient, knowing touch. Goldie, drawing on knowledge learned from her father, a country doctor, knelt in the straw. She spoke to the nervous animal in a low, soothing voice as her hands gently probed the swollen leg. She worked with a quiet competence, wrapping the joint in cloths soaked in a cool herbal infusion she'd prepared. Sawyer stood in the doorway, watching. He saw the way she worked, her movements careful and deliberate. He saw that she was not afraid of the animal's pain, nor was she squeamish about the task. What she feared, he began to understand, was not hardship or injury, but indifference. She was a woman who could not abide the quiet cruelty of neglect. Together, they worked to mend the section of fence that Crow's men had presumably broken. The sun was relentless, and the work was hard. As they stretched a new line of wire, Goldie's sharp eyes caught something in the dirt. Half hidden under a clump of sagebrush was a deep rut, different from the tracks of Sawyer's own wagon. Kneeling down, she examined it closely. There was a distinct, irregular pattern in the impression. She followed the track for a few yards until she found the source. A broken leaf spring on a wagon had been crudely repaired. Bound together with thick sisal twine, it was a makeshift, sloppy fix, the kind a man in a hurry, with little care for his equipment, would make. It was the mark of Silas Crow's men, proof that their visit hadn't been a simple delivery of a notice. The evenings became their sanctuary. After a simple meal of beans and cornbread, the threat of Crow and his 14-day deadline would descend upon the small cabin. Their only weapon was a single, heavy book Sawyer owned, a compendium of territorial and railroad laws. It was dense, filled with dry, impenetrable language. They would sit at the table, a single oil lamp casting a pool of golden light between them, creating an island of intimacy in the vast, dark plains. Goldie would read aloud, her clear voice giving life and sense to the convoluted legal phrases. She had a gift for untangling the knots of the law, for finding the loopholes and precedents hidden within the jargon. Sawyer would listen, his chair tilted back against the wall, his eyes closed. He listened with an intensity that surprised her, as if her voice were a rare and precious rain, and he was a parched land soaking up every drop. It was during one of these evenings that the stories of their pasts finally began to surface. Hesitantly at first, Goldie told him about Kestrel Bend. She explained how, as a junior clerk at the land office, she had a mind for numbers that was both a gift and a curse. She had noticed small discrepancies in the ledgers, insignificant at first, but forming a pattern over time. It was Crow's scheme, a slow and patient siphoning of funds, disguised as clerical errors and land survey fees. When she had gathered enough proof to confront the senior clerk, she found herself walking into a trap. Crow had been one step ahead. He used her own discovery, twisting it to make her look like the culprit. She was publicly accused of embezzlement, her reputation destroyed. She left town with nothing but the clothes on her back and a burning sense of injustice. When she finished, the only sound was the hiss of the lamp. Sawyer opened his eyes. He didn't offer empty words of sympathy. His own story, when it came, was far shorter, a mere fragment of a memory offered up with visible reluctance. He stared into the depths of his tin cup as if the past were reflected there. "I lost someone. A long time ago," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "During a fire season, the kind where the whole world seems to turn to tinder. That was all." He offered no names, no details, but Goldie saw the truth of his loss in the sudden, hollow emptiness of his eyes, and in the way his knuckles turned white as his hand tightened around the tin cup, threatening to crush it. A whole world of grief was contained in that single, stark statement. And so, a new routine was born, a rhythm as steady and repeating as the work of a blacksmith's hammer. The days were a litany of essential tasks: water, grass, horses, kitchen, book. The work was hard, the comforts few. But for both Goldie and Sawyer, this simple, shared existence began to take on a profound new meaning. It was a quiet rebellion against the chaos that threatened them. It was the slow, careful process of building something together, something worth defending. That night, before blowing out the lamp, Goldie opened her notebook. She dipped her charcoal stick in a little water to make the line dark and permanent. Beneath her sketch of the forged seal, she wrote a single, new observation, a thought that had crystallized over the course of the long day. "Here," she wrote, "everything is as durable as a rain. If one link breaks, the entire journey is compromised." The days at Half Moon Wash settled into a tense quiet, a fragile peace before a gathering storm. For Goldie, the ticking clock of Crow's 14-day deadline was a constant, maddening rhythm in the back of her mind. She spent the long evenings poring over the tattered land manifest she had managed to save from her life in Kestrel Bend, its pages thin and brittle as a dragonfly's wing. It was an official document from 2 years prior, a catalog of homestead claims in the region, each authenticated with the official seal of the Territorial Land Office, under the focused golden glow of the oil lamp. She placed her charcoal sketch of Crow's forged seal next to an authentic one on the manifest. To a casual observer, they were identical. The same proud eagle, The same bundle of arrows, the same ornate lettering. But Goldie's eyes were not casual. She had spent years scrutinizing ledgers, looking for the tiny tells of a forger's hand. She traced the outer ring of both seals with the tip of her finger, again and again. Then she saw it. It was a minuscule detail, a flaw so small it was almost invisible. On the authentic seal from the manifest, there was a tiny nick in the eagle's left wing, a minute imperfection from the original die-cast. In her sketch of the seal from Crow's foreclosure notice, that nick was gone. The edge was perfect, smooth. Her breath caught in her throat. It wasn't a mistake. A forger might be able to replicate a design, but they would not know to replicate a flaw. This meant Crow's seal wasn't just a copy. It was a new creation, likely cast from a mold made after the original die had been subtly filed down to remove that telltale imperfection. It was cold, hard proof of a deliberate, premeditated fraud. The nearest town with a telegraph station was Dust Devil Fork, a day's ride away. Goldie knew she had to go. Sawyer, without question, provided her with a steady mare and a small pouch of coins for the journey. He simply said, "Watch your back," his eyes conveying a depth of concern that his words did not. Dust Devil Fork was little more than a single dusty street lined with false-fronted buildings, dominated by the noise and smell of the salted juniper, a saloon that doubled as the town's social hub. The telegraph office was a small, cramped booth in the corner of the saloon, and sitting behind the counter, his eyes shielded by a green visor, was Jeb Whitlow. He was a young man with a nervous disposition and a past that included a brief, unspoken admiration for Goldie when she had passed through town months before. Goldie approached the counter, offering a small, weary smile. "Jeb, it's good to see you." He looked up, and a faint blush crept up his neck. "Miss Vance, I heard you left Kestrel Bend. News travels fast," she said, her tone light, belying the knot of anxiety in her stomach. "I'm doing some work for a rancher out at Half Moon Wash, Mr. Hale. He needs me to look into some old land transfers, just confirming some details for his records." She slid a piece of paper across the counter. On it, she had written Scrip Homestead 47B and the names of the 7 surrounding properties. "I just need to see the telegraph logs for any transactions related to these parcels over the last 6 months. It's just a formality." Jeb's eyes darted around the noisy saloon. "Miss Vance, I can't. Those logs are private. Company policy." Goldie leaned in slightly, her voice dropping. "Jeb, the man I'm working for is being pushed off his land by the railroad. By Silas Crow. I know you're a good man. You know what's right. She didn't mention her own history with Crow. She didn't need to. His name was enough. Fear and respect were the two currencies Crow dealt in, and Jeb was clearly paid in the former." He hesitated, his fingers drumming a nervous rhythm on the counter. Finally, with a deep sigh of resignation, he unlocked a heavy ledger from a drawer beneath the counter and pushed it towards her. "Just be quick about it," he whispered. Goldie's fingers flew across the pages, her eyes scanning the columns of dates, codes, and destinations. And then she found them. A series of 7 land purchases, all made within the last 4 months. They were all cash sales, transferred to an anonymous holding company, and every single telegraphic order had been placed by the same sender, an operator who used a single, cryptic identifier, Raven 13. The parcels of land formed a perfect, unbroken chain around Sawyer's property. While Goldie was chasing paper trails, Sawyer was engaged in a more tangible form of reconnaissance. Under the cover of a moonless night, he moved like a ghost through the scrubland surrounding Crow's new supply warehouse on the edge of the county. He didn't try to get inside. He simply watched and listened, his senses honed by years of tracking game and men. He noted the patterns of the guards, the timing of their rounds. On the 3rd night, he saw his opening. A wagon had delivered supplies, and in their haste, the guards had left several barrels outside the main building. Sawyer circled around, approaching from downwind. The air carried a sharp, acrid smell. He reached the barrels and carefully pried the lid off one. The pale moonlight revealed a fine, white powder, quicklime. In another barrel, he found a thick black, viscous substance, pine tar, on their own. They were simple industrial materials, but Sawyer knew their other uses. Quicklime could be used to foul a well, poisoning a rancher's only water source and forcing him to abandon his land. And the tar, when mixed with straw, was a potent accelerant, capable of turning a small spark into an inferno that could consume a barn or a house in minutes. These were not the tools of a land developer. They were the weapons of a predator. When Goldie returned to the ranch, her face grim with the knowledge she had unearthed, they pieced the puzzle together. On the cabin's rough table, she laid out her notes and sketched a map from memory, marking the 7 properties purchased by Raven 13. They formed a perfect semicircle around Sawyer's ranch. "It's a funnel," she said, her finger tracing the shape. "The seasonal rains. When they come, I'll run through these washes." She pointed to several dry riverbeds that crossed the properties. "They all converge right here." Her finger landed squarely on Sawyer's homestead. "Your land is the linchpin. It's the final piece he needs to control the entire watershed. He's not just building a railroad, he's building a reservoir, and he plans to make everyone else pay for the water." The scope of Crow's ambition was breathtaking, but they needed more than just a theory. They needed to connect him to the other accidents and misfortunes that had befallen ranchers in the area. Sawyer knew who to ask. Their journey took them deep into the canyons, to a place the railroad maps didn't show. Here, in a small adobe dwelling nestled against the red rock, lived a woman known as Green Maze. She was a Yaqui healer, a woman of indeterminate age with eyes that held the wisdom of the desert itself. She was the unofficial historian of the region, the keeper of its secrets. In a worn, leather-bound book, she kept a record of every birth, every death, every significant event that occurred in the canyons. They sat with her in the cool shade of her porch, explaining their situation. When they mentioned the fire that had destroyed the granary on the Miller homestead the previous year, Green Maze nodded slowly. "I remember," she said, her voice like the rustle of dry leaves. "A bad business." The wind was blowing from the north that night, strong. She opened her book, her finger tracing a line of spidery script. But the fire, it burned from the south. It burned against the wind. She looked up at them, her dark eyes sharp and knowing. A fire does not do that on its own. She rose and went inside, returning a moment later with a small, cloth-wrapped bundle. She carefully unwrapped it, revealing a piece of charred wood. Embedded in the blackened surface, perfectly preserved, was the distinct impression of a handprint, sealed in a dark, resinous substance. "Pine tar," Sawyer said, his voice a low growl. "From the fire." Goldie leaned in, her heart pounding. It was tangible proof, a direct link between the materials Sawyer had found and the pattern of accidents that had plagued their neighbors. She carefully rewrapped the piece of wood. This was evidence a judge could not ignore. Their fragile hope was short-lived. A few days later, Sawyer rode into Dust Devil Fork for supplies and found a new document pinned to the public notice board outside the general store. It was a pre-sale contract, declaring his intent to sell his land to the railroad, and at the bottom was his signature, expertly forged. It was a cruel, brilliant move by Crow. It was designed to turn the community against Sawyer, to paint him as a traitor who had sold out his neighbors. It was a psychological blow, meant to isolate and break him before the final deadline. That night, the mood in the cabin was somber. The walls seemed to close in around them. The weight of Crow's power, his cunning, felt immense. To run seemed the only logical choice. But as Goldie looked at the evidence they had gathered, her sketch of the seal, the telegraph logs, the charred piece of wood, a different feeling began to take hold. It was a slow-burning anger, a defiant flame that pushed back against the encroaching darkness. She had run from Kestrel Bend. She would not run again. "No," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "We don't run. We fight." She looked at Sawyer, her eyes shining with a fierce determination. "We take this to a judge, but not just any judge, and not in some dusty back office. We expose him. We do it in public, where everyone can see the truth." She knew what she was proposing. The county court was in Coyote Bluff, and the market day, when the town would be filled with ranchers and settlers from all over the territory, was in 10 days. It was there they would make their stand. "There's only one man who will listen," Sawyer said after a long silence. "A man Crow can't buy. Judge Alvar Cardenas." He looked at Goldie. "But he's not in Coyote Bluff. He's circuit riding. Right now, he's in Silver Notch. Silver Notch was a mining town, a hard 3-day ride through treacherous country." The timeline was perilously tight. There was no more discussion. The decision had been made. They spent the rest of the evening preparing. Sawyer carefully gathered the physical evidence, the charred wood, the notice with the fake signature. Goldie, meanwhile, took out her small sewing kit. She painstakingly made copies of the telegraph logs and her own notes. Then, she took the original documents, folded them into a small, flat packet, and began to sew them into the inner lining of her chemise. It was a place of last resort, a hiding spot so intimate that no man would think to search for it. The only light in the cabin came from the single lamp on the table. The only sound was the soft, rhythmic pass of the needle through the worn cotton. Goldie's head was bent in concentration, her fingers moving with a steady, practiced grace. Sawyer watched her, his expression unreadable. When she was finished, she bit off the thread and looked up. Her eyes met his across the small pool of light. The space between them was charged with everything that had not been said. The fear, the hope, the grim understanding of the risks they were about to take. It was a moment of profound, unspoken commitment, a promise, sealed in silence, that from this point forward, they were in this together. They would either win, or they would burn. The news of Sawyer Hale's forged pre-sale contract, pinned as it was for all to see in Dust Devil Fork, had the desired effect. It planted seeds of doubt. But Silas Crow had underestimated the quiet currents of the high desert. While some ranchers muttered about Hale selling them out, others, who had known Sawyer for years, felt the prickle of injustice. They knew the man. He was silent. Yes, solitary. But he was not a traitor. In the days leading up to their departure for Silver Notch, a strange, unspoken shift occurred. The isolation of Half Moon Wash began to recede. It started with the children. Goldie, unwilling to let their education falter, moved her classroom from the patch of dirt by the porch to the shade of a sprawling, ancient mesquite tree that stood halfway between Sawyer's ranch and the settlers' homesteads. Isla and Pax were soon joined by 2 other children from a neighboring family. Word spread that the new woman at Hale's place was a proper teacher. Soon, the lessons under the mesquite tree became a small, daily gathering. The children's parents, at first hesitant, began to linger. They came bearing small gifts of gratitude, tokens of a bartering economy where cash was scarce but dignity was plentiful. A half-dozen fresh eggs from Mrs. Davies, a roughly cut bar of lye soap from the Sloans, a small pouch of dried apples. And with these gifts, they brought information. They brought whispers, rumors, and fragmented stories, offered quietly while the children practiced their letters. They spoke of Crow's men measuring land that wasn't for sale, of cattle mysteriously sickening near railroad survey stakes. They brought the pieces of the puzzle that Goldie and Sawyer had been missing. One afternoon, Mattie Sloan, Isla and Pax's mother, waited until the other families had departed. She was a young widow, her face worn with a tiredness that went deeper than physical labor. She held a folded piece of paper in her hand, her knuckles white. "Miss Vance," she began, her voice low and trembling slightly. I heard what you're trying to do. Fighting Mr. Crow." She looked over her shoulder, as if afraid of being overheard even in the vast, empty landscape. "My husband, before he passed, he'd built up a debt at the mercantile. Mr. Crow bought it." She unfolded the paper. It was an invoice from the freight office in a town 2 counties over, a purchase for 10 gallons of pine tar and 2 barrels of quicklime. The purchase order was signed by one of Crow's henchmen, but in the notes section, written in the clerk's hurried script, were the words, "Hold for collection by S. Crow, Red Mesa. He came to see me last month," Mattie whispered. her eyes fixed on the dust. He said he knew how hard it was, a woman alone. He said he'd be willing to forgive the debt in exchange for my land. He said it was for the good of the territory. Her face hardened with a shame that wasn't hers. He implied there were other ways a woman could settle such a thing. I told him I'd sooner burn the place to the ground myself. Goldie's hand rested on Maddie's arm. This is brave, Maddie. This is proof. That's not all, Maddie said, finding strength. This invoice. He wanted me to sign for it, to say I'd taken delivery of it, as part of the debt payment. He was trying to make me the one who bought it. I refused. This was the link. Crow wasn't just buying the materials. He was actively trying to create a false trail, to frame an innocent, vulnerable woman for his own impending crimes. The next piece came from Mr. Fordyce, the town blacksmith. He was a formidable man, broad-shouldered and powerful despite having lost his left arm below the elbow in a mill accident years before. He'd learned to work the forge with a clever series of hooks and a hammer modified to strap to his remaining forearm. Sawyer had spent a morning at his forge, not asking for help, but offering it, mending the blacksmith's heavy-duty wagon axle, a job Fordyce struggled with alone. As they worked, Sawyer laid out the facts. He spoke of the broken fences, the sisal twine, the forged seal. Fordyce listened, his one good hand expertly turning the hot metal. When Sawyer finished, Fordyce grunted. Crow. He spat, as if the name were a piece of grit. He was in my forge 2 weeks back, after dark, said he needed a horse reshod immediate. Hung around, asking questions, being a nuisance. I kicked him out. He picked up a handful of long fence staples he'd been making. Saw you mending that line, using these. Are you? Sawyer nodded. Fordyce picked up a small, sharp chisel and, with 2 quick, precise taps of his hammer, struck a tiny, unique mark 2 parallel lines into the head of each staple. He dumped a heavy canvas bag full of them into Sawyer's hand. Use these for your repairs from now on, he said, his voice a low rumble. If any of my staples, he stressed the word, show up at a fence that's been cut, or on a gate that's been forced, it means they were stolen from my forge. And I'll be happy to stand before any judge and swear that the only man snooping around my shop that night was Silas Crow himself. The web was growing, its strands now woven from forged steel as well as paper. Their circle of allies widened further, and from an unexpected source. An old veteran named Elias Thorne, who lived in a small dugout on the edge of the county, hobbled into the ranch one day. The leather straps on his wooden crutch had rotted and snapped. Sawyer, who could fix anything made of wood or leather, spent an hour meticulously replacing the straps, reinforcing the wood, making it stronger than before. Elias watched him with shrewd, appreciative eyes. A man's kindness is a rare thing in this territory. Son, most folks only fix what's theirs. A tool's a tool, Sawyer said gruffly. Testing the repair. Needs to work. Indeed. Elias settled the crutch under his arm, testing his weight on it. He nodded, satisfied. You're fighting the railroad. I know. They think this land is empty. They don't know what's under it. From a greasy pouch, the old soldier pulled a folded, yellowed map. It was an old military survey, drawn by hand. I was with the Topographical Corps. 4 I took a bullet in the leg. We were mapping for water. The railroad. They're digging wells based on surface signs. They're wrong, but their proposed line. He tapped the map. It runs right over the old Hohokam irrigation canals. And that canal system taps the only reliable aquifer in this whole county. He pointed to a spot on the map. It was Half Moon Wash. Your place. Son, you're not sitting on a creek. You're sitting on the taproot of the whole damn desert. The puzzle was complete. Crow wasn't just grabbing a funnel for rainwater. He was grabbing the source. With this flood of new evidence, Goldie needed a place to work, somewhere larger than the small cabin table. She chose the abandoned adobe church at the crossroads, a simple, one-room building with a packed earth floor and a few broken pews. It was a neutral, quiet space. She and Sawyer laid all the evidence out on the wide wooden pulpit, the manifest, the forged notice, the charcoal sketch of the seal, Mattie Sloane's invoice, the new aquifer map from Elias, and the charred piece of wood from Green Maze. It was no longer a collection of disparate facts. It was a story, a narrative of calculated greed. Goldie drew a new map, combining the aquifer data with the land purchases made by Raven 13. The shape that emerged was predatory. It was a hook, with Sawyer's land as the sharp, deadly point, aimed directly at the heart of the aquifer. They still had one lingering question, the fire that burned against the wind. Green Maze's testimony was powerful, but Goldie wanted to prove how it was done, as if the land itself were offering its assistance. A rare, unseasonal thunderstorm rolled in one afternoon, drenching the dry earth. The following day, while the ground was still damp and the air heavy with the scent of wet creosote, they made their experiment. Behind the barn, where the earth was bare, they built a small trench. They laid a line of dry brush in it, and at the south end, they poured a small amount of the pine tar Sawyer had borrowed from Crow's supply barrel. They lit the north end. The small fire sputtered, the flames licking north, pushed by the prevailing breeze. Then Sawyer lit the tar-soaked end. The tar caught with a sudden, violent whoosh. It produced a thick, oily black smoke and a fire that burned with a terrifying, independent heat. It didn't just ignore the wind. It created its own draft, consuming the brush and moving steadily south, directly against the breeze. They stamped it out, but the acrid smell of the tar hung in the air. They now had a perfect, demonstrable method for the crime. The day before they were to leave for Silver Notch, Isla and Pax ran to the ranch, their faces flushed with fear and importance. They had been near the Mercantile in Dust Devil Fork when two of Crow's men rode up. They were talking to Mr. Simmons, the storekeep, Isla said, breathless. They asked him what day, Mr. Hale usually goes to Coyote Bluff for the market. Pax nodded, his eyes wide. Mr. Simmons told them you always go the day before, to get a good spot. He said you'd be leaving tomorrow. Early. The trap was set. Crow, having failed to intimidate Sawyer, was now planning to stop him permanently. He would never let them reach Judge Cardenas. Goldie's mind raced. They'll be watching the main road. They'll expect us to leave at dawn. She looked at Sawyer, a new plan forming in her eyes. So we'll make sure they see what they expect to see. She turned to Isla. I need you and your mother to do something. I need you to go back to town. Be seen. Talk loudly about how Mr. Hale is packing his wagon for an early start tomorrow. Can you do that? The girl, sensing the importance, nodded gravely. We won't take the main road, Goldie said to Sawyer after the children had gone. And we won't leave at dawn, she pointed to the old military map. We'll leave tonight, under cover of dark, and we'll take this route. Her finger traced a thin, winding line that skirted the canyons. The old Hohokam irrigation ditch. It was a longer, more difficult path, but it was one that Crow's men would never think to watch. That evening, as a deep purple twilight settled over the ranch, they made their final preparations. The community that had slowly rallied around them came to see them off. It wasn't a crowd, just a small, determined group. Maddie Sloan, Mr. Fordyce, and old Elias Thorne. Green Maze arrived as well, a silent figure in the dusk. She pressed a small, deerskin pouch into Goldie's hand. It was filled with dried herbs, chamomile, lavender, and sage. For the journey, the old woman said, her voice soft. When the heart beats too fast, you breathe this. Remember the smell of the earth. It will remind you which way is home. The community's perception of Sawyer had fundamentally changed. They no longer saw the grim, solitary man who kept the world at bay. They saw a pillar, a silent anchor who had refused to break, and in doing so, had given them all the courage to stand with him. There was no grand speech, no call to arms. Instead, in the deep darkness, lit only by a single lantern, Mr. Fordyce thrust the handle of a shovel into the red dirt. My land ain't for sale, he said, his voice rough. He placed his one good hand on the wooden handle. Nor mine, Maddie Sloan said. Placing her hand next to his, Elias Thorne added his, followed by Sawyer. Finally, Goldie placed her hand on the worn wood, her skin brushing Sawyer's. It was not a prayer, and they needed no Bible. It was an oath, sealed by the feel of the earth beneath their feet and the shared grip of their hands. A promise to the land itself. As the others dispersed into the night, disappearing back to their own homesteads, Sawyer and Goldie readied the horses. The air was cold, the stars sharp and bright as chips of ice. Sawyer turned to Goldie. From his saddlebag, he pulled a pair of leather work gloves. They were not new. They were his own, worn soft as butter, stained with sweat and work, and molded perfectly to the shape of a human hand. He held them out to her. "It's a long ride to Silver Notch," he said, his voice gruff, almost shy. "The reins will be hard on your hands. You can't have them tearing. Not now." Goldie looked at the gloves, then up at his face, shadowed in the faint starlight. She slid her hands into them. The leather was still warm from his body, a tangible, intimate warmth that enveloped her. It was a gesture more profound than a kiss, a practical, tender act of protection. "Thank you." "Sawyer," she whispered. He simply nodded and swung himself up into the saddle. "Let's ride." The night was star-dusted and cold, the silence of the high desert so profound it felt like a weight. Above them, the pinprick cluster of the Pleiades hung like a silver pendant over the dark, jagged silhouette of Santa Loba Butte. A lone wolf howled, the sound carrying for miles, a mournful cry that seemed to echo the emptiness inside Goldie. They were traveling through the ancient, dry irrigation system of the Hohokam people, a winding sunken scar in the earth known as the Serpent Ditch. It offered cover from the open plain, but it was slow going. Sawyer rode in front, his figure a dark shape against the paler sand of the ditch floor. He trusted her judgment, and she had taken the lead on navigation. She dismounted, her boots sinking into the soft earth. Kneeling, she pressed her bare palm, the leather of his glove tucked into her belt flat against the ground. She was checking for moisture, for the compacted, harder sand that would bear the horse's weight without sound. "This way," she whispered, pointing to a barely visible line where the shadows were deepest. "The ground is firmer to the left." He nodded, not questioning, and urged his horse forward. They moved like shadows, the only sound the soft padding of hooves on damp sand and the creak of saddle leather. They were approaching a dense grove of cottonwood trees that marked a shallow river crossing, the only way out of the ditch system before it veered west. It was the sudden, unnatural silence that warned him. The night insects had stopped their chirping. Sawyer's hand went to the rifle in its scabbard. "Wait," he breathed. From the darkness of the cottonwoods, two figures emerged, blocking the path. Moonlight glinted off the long barrel of a Winchester. "That's far enough." "Hail!" a rough voice called out. It was one of Crow's men, the lanky one with the cruel mouth. "Mister, Crow don't like people skulking around in the dark. Get off the horses. Slow." Another man emerged from the trees to their right, his own rifle leveled. They were trapped. Goldie's heart hammered against her ribs, the sound so loud she was sure they could hear it. Sawyer's body was utterly still, silhouetted against the night. He didn't reach for his rifle. Instead, his hand moved slowly, deliberately, toward the Colt at his hip. "Just want to pass. Gentlemen?" Sawyer's voice was calm, almost conversational, but it vibrated with a low intensity that cut through the night. "No trouble. Trouble's what you got," the first man sneered, taking a step forward. He held a torch in his other hand, a greasy, smoking brand that cast flickering, monstrous shadows. "Now, get down, or else." Sawyer moved. It was not a fast draw, not the kind of thing they wrote about in dime novels. It was a single, economical, and brutally precise motion. He drew his revolver, aimed not at the man, but at the surface of the river water just beside him, and fired. The explosion of the gunshot was shocking in the silence. The bullet struck the water, sending a high, violent splash of icy river water erupting directly into the face and torch of the lead man. The man roared in surprise, stumbling back, the torch hissing as the water hit it. The horses, already spooked by the riflemen, panicked at the gunshot and the sudden splash. Sawyer's mare reared, and in that same instant, Goldie, acting on pure, desperate instinct, reached into her satchel. She pulled out a small cloth pouch, a mix of black pepper and cayenne she kept for cooking and with all her strength. She threw its contents directly at the second man's torch. The fine, acrid powder hit the open flame and ignited in a blinding flash. A miniature explosion of searing, chemical smoke. The second man screamed as the cloud of pepper dust enveloped his face. He dropped his rifle, his hands flying to his eyes, coughing and retching violently. "Go!" Sawyer yelled, grabbing the reins of Goldie's horse and slapping its rump hard. The horses bolted. They plunged into the shallow river, chaos erupting behind them. The first man, sputtering and blind, fired his rifle into the darkness where they had been a second before. The shot went wide, the bullet singing harmlessly into the night. The second man was on his knees, incapacitated by the pepper. Sawyer and Goldie galloped through the river, the horses' hooves churning the water into silver spray. They didn't look back. They rode hard for the far bank, disappearing into the maze of arroyos on the other side. They followed the game trails for another hour, pushing the horses hard, their breath coming in ragged gasps. The path led them to a rickety wooden bridge spanning a deep, narrow chasm. It was old, built by prospectors decades ago, and it looked unsteady in the moonlight. "We have to cross," Sawyer said, his voice still tight with adrenaline. "It's the only way up to the high mesa." He went first, his horse's hooves making hollow, protesting sounds on the warped planks. Goldie followed, her heart in her throat. She was halfway across when she heard a sharp, splintering crack. The plank directly under her horse's front legs gave way. The animal screamed, lurching violently. Goldie was thrown from the saddle, a cry of terror torn from her lips. She felt herself falling, but before she could drop into the blackness of the chasm, an arm like a steel band wrapped around her waist. Sawyer, who had been just ahead, had thrown himself from his own horse. He caught her, pulling her back from the brink. His momentum carried them both backward, and his back slammed hard against one of the thick wooden support posts of the bridge. The impact knocked the breath from him with a sharp grunt. Goldie was pressed tightly against his chest, her face buried in the rough wool of his duster. The bridge shuddered beneath them. Her horse, in a desperate scramble, managed to find purchase and lunged forward, galloping to safety on the far side. For a long moment, they didn't move. Goldie was shaking, her fingers clutching the front of his shirt. She could feel the solid, steady thud of his heart against her cheek, a powerful, reassuring rhythm in the terrifying dark. It was beating fast, but with a controlled strength. The damp wool of his shirt smelled of the river, of horse, and of him. "You're all right," he said, his voice a low rumble in her ear. "I've got you." He held her for another second, his arm an unyielding bar of protection, before he gently set her back on her feet. "We walked them the rest of the way," he said, his voice already returning to its normal, steady cadence. They found shelter just before the sky began to gray in the east. It was a shallow cave, little more than a hollowed-out space in the rock face, but it was dry and out of the wind. They built a small, smokeless fire from dry mesquite twigs. They sat in silence, the events of the night catching up with them. Goldie found she couldn't stop shaking. It wasn't the cold. The fire was warm, and the adrenaline had left her feeling hot and wired. It was the delayed shock, the lingering terror of the fall, the memory of his arm around her. Sawyer watched her, his expression unreadable in the flickering firelight. He removed his heavy wool duster, the one still damp from the river, and wrapped it around her shoulders. It was heavy, and it carried his scent, a comforting, grounding weight. "Get some rest," he said. He didn't lie down. He took his rifle, checked its load, and sat at the mouth of the cave, his back to her, his eyes fixed on the graying landscape. He was a sentinel, a silent guardian, and as Goldie huddled in the warmth of his coat, she felt a profound and unfamiliar sense of safety. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in months, she slept without fear. When she woke, sunlight was streaming into the cave. Sawyer was standing over her, holding his canteen. "We need to move." He led her to a high ridge overlooking the path they had taken. He pointed down. In the soft dirt of the trail below, there was a fresh set of hoof prints. "They're ahead of us," Sawyer said, his voice flat. Goldie frowned. "But how we lost them at the river?" "They didn't follow. They circled." He pointed to a specific set of tracks. "Look, the prints are facing backward. An old trick. They rode past, then turned their horses and backed them into the brush to make it look like they were waiting in ambush. Facing the wrong way. They wanted to flush us out. When we didn't show, they guessed we knew a different route. They're ahead of us, blocking the main pass to Silver Notch." He had been outthought. Crow's men were not just thugs. They were clever. "We can't go back," Goldie said, her mind racing. "No!" Sawyer pointed to the high, serrated ridge to the north. "There's another way. The miners call it Crow's Trough. It's not a pass. It's a fissure. Steep. And the footing is bad. But it will get us to Silver Notch by midday. And they won't be watching it." Crow's Trough was a nightmare. It was a narrow, winding cut in the rock, barely wide enough for a single horse, and the path was little more than a ledge of shifting scree. The wind howled through the high, narrow walls, a high-pitched wailing sound that set Goldie's teeth on edge. Sawyer led his horse, and Goldie followed with hers. Near the summit, the path grew even steeper. Goldie's mare, her shoes slipping on the loose rock, stumbled. She whinnied, her eyes white with panic, as her back legs slid perilously close to the edge. Without a word, Sawyer handed his reins to Goldie. "Hold him, steady." He moved back to her horse, speaking in a low, calm voice, his hand on its neck. He grabbed the bridle, planting his own boots firmly in the loose rock. "Goldie, take her mane. When I pull, you push. Keep her head up. Don't let her look down." "Ready," she said, her voice tight. Now Sawyer heaved, using his entire body as leverage. Goldie pushed against the horse's flank, urging it forward. For a terrifying second, the animal scrambled, its hooves sending a cascade of rocks tumbling into the chasm below. Then it found its footing and lunged forward onto a wider, solid ledge. They stood, panting. Horse and humans alike covered in sweat and dust. They had worked as one, a seamless, unspoken partnership born of pure necessity. They didn't pause to congratulate each other. They just remounted and pushed on. They rode into Silver Notch just after noon. The town was a chaotic, noisy collection of tents, shanties, and a few permanent buildings, all clinging to the side of a mountain. The air was thick with the smell of pine smoke, blasting powder, and unwashed men. Jeb Whitlow was waiting for them outside the assay office, just as he'd promised in a telegraph message Goldie had sent before leaving. He looked even more nervous than he had in Dust Devil Fork, his eyes darting to every stranger who passed. "Miss Vance, Mr. Hale," he stammered, pushing a thick envelope into Goldie's hand. "I got them. Certified copies of the telegraph logs, all of them, with the official postal and wire service seal. It's all legal. I hope this is worth it. If Crow finds out I did this, you did the right thing." "Jeb," Goldie said, tucking the envelope inside her shirt, next to the packet sewn into her chemise. "You're a good man." Judge Alvar Cardenas was not in a fancy courtroom. He was holding session in the back room of the town's only hotel, a space that smelled of stale beer and fried bacon. He was a lean, hawk-nosed man with eyes as gray and uncompromising as the granite of the mountains. He listened to Goldie's story without interruption, his face an impassive mask. He examined the forged notice, Maddie Sloane's invoice, the aquifer map, and the new certified telegraph logs from Jeb. When she finished, he steepled his long fingers and stared at the evidence for a long time. "You have built a strong case. Miss Vance," he said finally, his voice a dry rasp. "Fraud, conspiracy, and, if you can prove that fire test, attempted arson. Silas Crow has been a shadow on this territory for too long, always one step beyond the reach of the law." He rose from his chair. "The market day in Coyote Bluff is in 5 days. I will be there. I will convene a special session of the court in the town square. If I have to, justice will be served." Relief washed over Goldie. so powerful it almost made her dizzy. But the judge held up a hand. "Do not celebrate yet. You have given me the weapon, Mr. Hale. But I am only one man. Crow has money and men. This," he tapped the envelope, "is just paper. He will move to silence you both long before you ever get a chance to speak in my court. You must get back to Coyote Bluff. You must get there before Crow knows I am coming. You must guard this evidence with your lives." The journey back was a new kind of hell. Word of their visit to the judge had clearly preceded them. Crow's men were no longer hiding in the shadows. They were operating in the open. When they reached the main toll bridge over the Purgatory River, they found the way blocked. Crow had set up his own toll, an illegal checkpoint, claiming a railroad right-of-way. Several wagons were backed up, the drivers arguing with the same thuggish men who had ambushed them in the ditch. The air was thick with tension, the simmering anger of a community being pushed too far. "He's boxing us in," Sawyer said, pulling their wagon, a small, nondescript freight wagon he'd traded their horses for in Silver Notch off the main road. "He's daring us to make a move." "Then we don't make the move he expects," Goldie said. They detoured to Dust Devil Fork, approaching Mr. Fordyce's smithy from the back alley. They explained the situation. The one-armed blacksmith didn't hesitate. "He thinks he's got you," Fordyce rumbled. "He'll be watching for this wagon, for you two. So, we'll give him something else to look at." He set to work, with astonishing speed. Sawyer and Fordyce replaced one of the wagon's axles with a slightly older, squeakier one Fordyce had in his yard. They swapped the water barrel for 3 larger ones, marked lard. While they worked, Goldie took a blank shipping label, and with her charcoal, she scrawled a new destination: Simmons Mercantile, Coyote Bluff, freight. She mixed a small paste of flour and water and carefully pasted the label over the official land office seal painted on the wagon's side. "It'll pass at a distance," Sawyer said, stepping back to admire their work. It was no longer the wagon of a desperate rancher. It looked like a simple, unremarkable freight delivery. As they prepared to leave, the sky was changing. The brilliant blue had been replaced by sickly, yellowish-gray haze. The air was still, but it felt charged, electric. A dry storm was brewing. The wind began to pick up, hot and abrasive, carrying no promise of rain, only dust and static. Goldie's hair began to lift from her head, crackling faintly. The tension in the air was a perfect mirror of the tension in their hearts. The final confrontation was coming, and it would be as sudden and violent as the lightning that was about to break. They made camp in Red Willow Gulch, a narrow, winding canyon that offered shelter from the hot, relentless wind of the dry storm. The air was alive with a dry, electric hum, and the sky overhead was a starless, bruised purple. A fire of gnarled juniper wood crackled in a ring of stones, its light pushing back against a darkness that felt absolute. The only other sound was the regular sewing machine whir of crickets, a sound that seemed to measure out the final, tense hours before the dawn. Tomorrow was Coyote Bluff. Tomorrow was the reckoning. The heat had lingered long after sunset. Goldie sat on a flat rock near the fire, wiping a sheen of sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand. Her hair, which she had unbound from its tight bun, felt heavy and damp against her neck. The journey, the fear, the constant vigilance had settled deep into her bones, an exhaustion so profound it was almost a physical ache. She stared into the flames, her mind a whirlwind of legal statutes, forged documents, and the cold, dead-eyed face of Silas Crow. Sawyer moved from the wagon, his steps nearly silent on the sandy ground. He stopped in front of her, holding out his canteen. He didn't speak, but the offer was clear. She looked up, her eyes meeting his in the flickering firelight. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice hoarse. As she reached for the canteen, his fingers brushed against the back of her wrist. It was a fleeting contact, but a jolt of heat that had nothing to do with the temperature shot through her, a stark and vivid sensation against the backdrop of her weariness. She saw his gaze flicker. His jaw tightened for a fraction of a second before he pulled his hand away. She took the canteen, her own hand suddenly unsteady, and drank deeply of the cool, metallic-tasting water. He sat down on the rock beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. For a long time, they were silent, two solitary figures watching the fire dance, cocooned in a small circle of light against the immense, hostile darkness of the world. It was Sawyer who finally broke the silence, his voice a low rumble that seemed to be pulled from the very earth beneath them. "Are you afraid?" Goldie let out a short, humorless laugh. "Is there any other sensible thing to be?" She handed the canteen back to him. "I'm terrified, not just of Crow, of failing, of all those people who are trusting us, Maddie, Fordyce, Elias. What if we've led them all to ruin?" He took a slow drink before answering, his eyes fixed on the flames. "That's a fear. Right enough, but it's not the one that keeps me awake." He lowered the canteen, his knuckles white where he gripped it. "The fear isn't for the land. I've lived on nothing before. I can do it again." He turned his head, his gaze meeting hers, and in his eyes, she saw a raw vulnerability that stole her breath. It's the thought of facing the silence after, alone. It's the thought of losing. His gesture was small, a slight movement of his hand that encompassed the fire, the shared space between them, the entire fragile alliance they had built. The honesty of his admission cracked something open inside her. He had given voice to the deepest, most secret terror in her own heart. The fight was no longer just about justice or land. It had become about him, about the quiet, unbreakable man who had wrapped his coat around her in a cold cave and whose presence had become as essential as air. "I know," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. "That is my fear, too." She felt an overwhelming need to be just as honest, to lay her own broken pieces before him, to see if the foundation they had built could bear the weight. "Sawyer," she began, her voice barely audible over the crackle of the fire. "There's something you should know about me. Before we—" She trailed off, struggling for the words. She took a deep breath. "Back in Kestrel Bend, after the trouble, I was sick for a time. The doctor, he told me that I would never be able to have children." She said the words flatly, a stark and painful fact she had carried alone for years. It was a secret shame, a mark of her incompleteness in a world where a woman's worth was so often measured by her ability to bear sons. She watched his face, bracing herself for the pity, the awkwardness, or the quiet, calculated withdrawal she expected. Sawyer did none of those things. He simply looked at her, his expression unchanging, for a long, silent moment. The firelight carved deep shadows on his face, making it impossible to read his thoughts. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, but it held a certainty that was as solid and real as the rock they were sitting on. "A home needs a heart. Goldie," he said, "not a birth certificate." Tears welled in her eyes, hot and sudden, tears of relief, of a gratitude so profound it felt like a physical release. He had not tried to fix her, or pity her, or dismiss her pain. He had simply accepted her, all of her, with a grace that was as stunning as it was unexpected. A gust of hot wind swept through the canyon, sending a shower of glowing red embers scattering from the fire. One landed on her sleeve, and she flinched, brushing it away. The small, startling moment broke the spell of their conversation. Without thinking, she leaned her head against his shoulder. It was a simple, instinctive gesture, a need for contact, for reassurance. She felt his body tense for a second, surprised by the contact, and then he relaxed. She closed her eyes, listening to the steady, powerful beat of his heart through the thick fabric of his shirt. After a moment, she felt the weight of his hand, warm and calloused, settle on her back. He didn't caress her or pull her closer. His hand just rested there, a question asked without words, a silent offer of comfort. She leaned into the touch, a silent answer of acceptance. "We should get some sleep," he murmured, his voice thick, but neither of them moved. Slowly, he shifted, pulling the heavy wool blanket from his bedroll. He draped it around both their shoulders, creating a shared sanctuary against the night. They sat closer now, hip to hip, shoulder to shoulder, wrapped in the same blanket, watching the fire burn down. Goldie rested her forehead against the hard plane of his chest. His breathing was a slow, steady rhythm, and she found her own breath unconsciously syncing with his. It was a moment of profound, peaceful intimacy, more tender than any passionate embrace. It was a language of respect, of two weary souls finding a moment of rest in each other. He tilted her chin up with his thumb and forefinger. His eyes searched hers in the firelight, asking another, more urgent question. She gave him the smallest of nods. The first kiss came as gently as the desert twilight. It was not rushed or hungry. His lips met hers with a soft, hesitant pressure, a touch that was less acclaiming and more a promise. It was a kiss that spoke of shared hardship, of mutual respect, of a deep and abiding recognition. His hand moved from her back to her shoulder blade, his fingers spreading wide, holding her with a touch that was both incredibly gentle and unbreakably firm. She responded, her lips parting slightly. A tremor ran through her, a shudder that was not born of passion, but of the profound, bone-deep relief of being safe, of being seen, of being home. The fire chose that moment to flare up, a log collapsing and sending a bright plume of golden flame into the air. The sudden light illuminated their faces. Sawyer broke the kiss, pulling back just enough to look at her. And then he smiled. It was a small thing, just a slight upturn at the corners of his mouth, but on his stern, weathered face, it was as startling and beautiful as a wildflower blooming in the rock. It reached his eyes, crinkling the corners, filling them with a warmth she had never seen there before. The sight of it, so rare and unexpected, broke the tension in Goldie. A soft laugh, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy, bubbled up from her throat. She buried her face in the curve of his neck, hiding from the intensity of the moment, breathing in his scent. He held her close, his hand stroking her hair. They stayed like that for a long time, the firelight playing over them. The unspoken desire was a palpable thing between them, a low, steady hum beneath the surface of the quiet. But the danger of the coming day was just as real, a shadow that could not be ignored. It was Goldie who pulled back first, her expression turning serious. "Sawyer," she said, her voice steady. "Tomorrow, we stand together in front of that whole town. We face him. We don't know what will happen." He nodded, his own smile fading, his expression turning grim as he understood what she was saying. "So tonight," she continued, laying down the law for them both, "we rest, and we promise. Tomorrow night, if we're both still whole, we will answer the rest." It was not a rejection. It was a pact, a postponement. It was an acknowledgement that what was growing between them was too precious to be consummated under the shadow of a threat, or taken in a moment of desperation. It deserved a future, a tomorrow that was not guaranteed. "Agreed," he said, his voice a low, solemn vow, with a newfound resolve. Goldie sat up and began to relace the front of her bodice. The simple, practical act was a reclaiming of herself, a preparation for the battle ahead. As she fumbled with the laces, Sawyer stood and turned his back to her, affording her a moment of privacy. He walked to the edge of the firelight and stood looking out into the impenetrable darkness of the gulch. The simple, profound respect in that gesture settled Goldie's heart. It made it beat not faster, but stronger, as steady as a horse's hoof on solid rock. When she was dressed, they laid out their separate bedrolls on opposite sides of the dying fire. Before he lay down, Sawyer took the long, sharp dagger from the sheath on his belt. He placed it on the ground in the space between them, its polished steel glinting in the ember's faint glow. It was not a barrier. It was not a warning. Goldie understood its meaning instantly. It was a symbol, a promise, a silent vow that he was her guardian, that he would protect her, even from himself, until they had earned their peace. She lay down, pulling the rough blanket up to her chin. The fire had burned down to a bed of glowing red coals, and above them, the clouds had passed, revealing a breathtaking sweep of the Milky Way, a river of diamonds scattered across a black velvet sky. As the last of the embers faded, she spoke his name, her voice a soft whisper in the vast, quiet darkness. "Sawyer, I'm here." She smiled in the dark. "It started then, didn't it?" she murmured, mostly to herself. "When we touched hands over the fence, Coyote Bluff on Market Day was a chaotic symphony of noise, dust, and commerce. The main square teemed with ranchers, miners, families, and merchants, all weaving between wagons loaded with feed, cages of chickens, and barrels of goods. The air was thick with the smells of horse manure, fresh bread, and the ever-present, biting alkali dust. The dry storm from the night before had passed, leaving the sky a hard, polished blue, but the electric tension remained, thrumming in the air. Silas Crow had already made his move, a masterstroke of psychological warfare. He had erected a large, garish canvas booth at the head of the square, emblazoned with the words, "Red Mesa Land Railroad. The future is here." Underneath, a smaller sign read, "New homestead parcels. Cheap land. Inquire within." He was creating an atmosphere of inevitability, a public declaration that the fight was already over and the land was his to sell. He was turning the community's desperation for a fresh start into a weapon against Sawyer. At precisely 10 o'clock, a hush fell over the crowd. Judge Alvar Cardenas emerged from the sheriff's office, his black frock coat immaculate, his hawk-like face set in an expression of grim neutrality. He was followed by a nervous-looking sheriff. The judge didn't move to the small, raised platform that served as a town stage. Instead, he walked to the center of the square, his boot heels striking the hard-packed earth with audible force. "By the authority of the Arizona Territorial Court," his voice rasped, cutting through the murmurs. "This market square is now a convened session of the court. I am here to hear a petition of fraud and conspiracy filed by Mr. Sawyer Hale and Miss Marigold Vance against Mr. Silas Crow and the Red Mesa Land Railroad Company." A collective gasp went up from the crowd. This was no mere dispute. This was a public challenge. Crow, who had been laughing with a potential land buyer, slowly turned, his face darkening. He and his two henchmen pushed their way to the front, their expressions a mix of arrogance and irritation. "Judge," Crow began, his voice oozing false respect. "This is highly irregular. A market day is hardly the place for serious legal, the law." "Mr. Crow is wherever I convene it," Cardenas snapped. "And it seems to me the entire public has an interest in this matter. Miss Vance, your petition." This was it. Goldie's heart hammered against her ribs, but the feel of Sawyer's solid presence just behind her, and the weight of the herbal pouch from Green Maze in her pocket, steadied her. She stepped forward, her voice clear and carrying. Holding the crowd's attention, "Your Honor," she began, "we present evidence of a systematic and fraudulent scheme to steal land, poison water, and intimidate the legal landowners of this county, one by one." She laid out their case, not on a lawyer's table, but on an upturned apple crate that served as a makeshift podium. She presented the certified telegraph logs, showing the pattern of anonymous purchases by Raven 13. She unfolded Elias Thorne's military map, showing the aquifer and how the purchased lands formed a perfect funnel to control it. She held up Maddie Sloan's falsified invoice for pine tar and quicklime. And finally, she placed the charred piece of wood from Green Maze's evidence on the crate. "Evidence of materials used to create accidents," Goldie stated. "Such as the fire at the Miller homestead, a fire which, according to eyewitness records, burned against the wind." The crowd murmured. They all remembered that fire. Crow laughed. "A short, barking sound. This is absurd. A few coincidences. Some old maps. This is a waste of the court's time. I have a legitimate prior sale contract for Mr. Hale's land. He agreed to sell. He simply has seller's remorse. He produced a document with a flourish. And I have the buyer, who Mr. Hale made the original deal with right here, Mr. Kane Dooley." A weasel-faced man with shifty eyes, Kane Dooley, stepped forward, nervously twisting his hat in his hands. "That's right, Your Honor." Dooley stammered, "Clearly coached, me and Mr. Hale." We struck a deal 2 months back. He agreed to sell to me, and I signed my interest over to Mr. Crow's company. That paper Sawyer posted, that was our deal. He's just trying to back out. The crowd's allegiance, so briefly with Goldie, began to waver. A contract was a contract. May I see the contract, mister? Dooley Goldie asked, her voice polite. Crow handed it to her, a smirk on his face. Goldie scanned the document. It was a simple agreement, with what purported to be Sawyer's signature at the bottom, alongside Kane Dooley's. Goldie's eyes fixed on Dooley's signature. She looked up at the man, who was now using his right hand to wipe sweat from his brow. Mr. Dooley, Goldie said, her voice still quiet. Are you a right-handed man? Dooley looked confused. I am. Yes, ma'am. You sign all your legal documents with your right hand. Well, of course, it's the only one I use, he said, trying for a weak joke. Goldie turned to the judge. Your Honor, I ask you to examine the signature of Mr. Dooley. Specifically, the loop of the letter in his last name. It is a distinct downward pulling loop, a common characteristic of a left-handed writer attempting to form the letter without smudging the ink. A tremor of excitement ran through her. This was the kind of detail forgers always missed. Now, Mr. Dooley, she said, turning back to the man, who had gone pale. Please take my charcoal pencil and write your name on this piece of paper. She held out her notebook. Dooley looked wildly at Crow, who gave him a furious, almost imperceptible shake of the head. I don't gotta write nothin', Dooley blustered. He doesn't have to, Your Honor, Crow interjected. No, Judge Cardenas said, his eyes glinting. He does not. But his refusal to do so will be noted by this court as highly illuminating. Dooley shrank back, his guilt plain on his face. The first crack in Crow's defense had appeared, before Crow could recover. Mr. Fordyce, the blacksmith, shouldered his way through the crowd. In his one good hand, he held up a small, dark object. Your Honor, Fordyce's voice boomed across the square. This here is a fence staple. I found it yesterday on Mr. Hale's property, where his fence was cut. This ain't just any staple. It has my mark on it. He held it for the judge to see 2 tiny, parallel lines. I marked these special for Mr. Hale. But the thing is, Your Honor, 3 weeks ago, my forge was broken into. A whole keg of these staples was stolen, and I am prepared to swear on any Bible you like that the only man snooping around my forge that very night was Silas Crow. The crowd gasped. This was not fraud. This was theft, sabotage. This is slander. Crow roared. Is it Jeb Whitlow's nervous voice cut in? He had pushed his way forward, his telegrapher's visor still on his head. Your Honor, I have the certified copies of the Raven 13 telegrams. The ones authorizing the anonymous land purchases. The judge took them. These are certified. I see. But how do we know they are connected to Mr. Crow? The relays, Sir Jeb said, gaining confidence as he spoke of his trade. A long-distance telegram isn't one message. It's a series of messages, relayed from one station to the next. Each relay operator adds his mark and a sequence number. All 7 of these purchases, though they arrived in Red Mesa from different relay points to look anonymous, originated from the same telegraph office in Tucson. An office, I might add, that is located in the same building as the Red Mesa Land Railroad Company's main headquarters. The crowd, many of whom relied on the telegraph, understood this perfectly. It was a chain of evidence, as real as one of Fordyce's staples. And what of this fire, the judge asked, turning his sharp gaze to the piece of charred wood. Green Mays stepped forward, her presence radiating a quiet authority that silenced the square. She did not address the judge. She addressed the people. I keep the records of this land, she said, her voice dry but carrying. I write the births, the deaths, the rains, and the fires. She held up her worn ledger. I wrote of the Miller fire. I wrote that the wind blew from the north. But the flames, they ran south. Fire does not lie. It does not go where it is not told. It does not burn against the wind. Crow let out an exasperated sigh, playing to the skeptics in the crowd. This is ridiculous. We're listening to folk tales. It was a hot, windy night. And that piece of wood, it's covered in pine tar. Your Honor, we are ranchers. Every man here has gotten tar on his hands mending a fence or waterproofing a roof. It means nothing. You are right. Mr. Crow, Goldie said, her voice clear and calm. The square went utterly silent. Pine tar itself means nothing. She knelt on the ground. From her satchel, she pulled a small cloth bag and a tin of matches. Sawyer, anticipating her, handed her the small sample of tar they had taken from Crow's barrel, but pine tar, when used as an accelerant, behaves in a very specific way. Goldie continued, her voice a calm lecture. She poured a small trail of sand on the hard-packed earth. At one end, she placed a small dollop of the thick, black tar. The crowd leaned in, breathless. The wind today, she said, is blowing gently from the east. She lit a match and set fire to the west end of the sand trail, the end without the tar. A small flame flickered and immediately died, snuffed out by the breeze. Now, she said. She struck another match and lit the east end, the end with the pine tar. The tar ignited with a viscous, oily foomp, a thick, black, acrid smoke billowed upwards. The flame did not flicker and die. It burned with a hot, hungry, independent life. And then, slowly, but visibly to everyone, the flame began to creep westward, against the breeze, feeding on the tar-soaked sand. It was crawling. It was burning against the wind. A wave of superstitious fear and dawning comprehension washed over the crowd. People crossed themselves. They had seen witchcraft. They had seen the truth. A fire that makes its own rules, Goldie said, standing up and brushing the dust from her skirt. A fire that runs where it is told. Just as Green Maze's record states, the case was all but won. Sawyer stepped forward and, without a word, handed the judge the final piece of paper, the fake pre-sale contract that Crow had pinned in the public square. Goldie picked up the original foreclosure notice, the one that had started it all. "Your Honor," she said, her voice ringing with the force of her conviction. "This all began with this foreclosure notice, a notice that bears a forged seal. Scrip Homestead 47B. She held up her original notebook, opened to the page with her first charcoal sketch, a seal that is missing the small, telltale imperfection, the nick in the eagle's wing that is present on every authentic document from that year. A seal that was deliberately recast to commit fraud. She pointed from the notice to the pre-sale contract, to the tar, to the staples. This is not a series of accidents, Your Honor. It is a single, unbroken chain of conspiracy, theft, fraud, and arson, all leading back to one man." She pointed directly at Silas Crow. "He forged the seal to steal the land. He forged the signature to discredit Mr. Hale. He used sabotage to drive out his neighbors. And he used fire to cover his tracks. He is attempting to steal the one thing that gives this community life its water, and he will not stop." The silence that followed was absolute. Judge Cardenas stared at Crow, his face a granite mask of cold fury. He lifted his gavel. He did not pound it. He brought it down onto the apple crate with a single, sharp, definitive crack that echoed through the entire square. "This court finds sufficient cause to investigate these grievous allegations." His voice was ice. "I am issuing a temporary injunction, effective immediately. All land transactions, sales, or transfers involving the Red Mesa Land Railroad Company are frozen. All of them." He pointed at the sheriff. "I will be in your office, reviewing this evidence for the issuance of arrest warrants. I expect them to be served by sundown." Crow's face had gone from red to a sickly white. He had been beaten, publicly, legally, utterly. But as the judge turned and began to walk toward the sheriff's office, the crowd parting before him like the sea, Crow's expression changed. The panic in his eyes was replaced by something else, something cold, reptilian, and far more dangerous. He knew the law had him, but the law was slow. He leaned in and whispered something to his two henchmen. His gaze then lifted, past the crowd, past the evidence, and locked onto Goldie. It was a look of pure, predatory hatred. It was a look that stripped away all pretense of civilization. It was not the look of a businessman who had lost a deal. It was the look of a hunter whose prey had just wounded him, and who now intended to tear it to pieces. Sawyer saw the look. He had seen it before, in the eyes of a cornered wolf, in the moments before a killing strike. He laid his hand on Goldie's arm, his touch a silent, urgent warning. He knew. The judge's gavel had ended the legal fight, but Crow's whisper had just begun the real one. The law would not be able to protect them by sundown. The storm was here. He leaned in close to Goldie, his voice a low, urgent murmur that no one else could hear. We can't stay here. We're exposed. We have to move. We lead them away from the town. We lead them home. Goldie looked at him, her eyes wide, understanding his meaning instantly. They would not wait for the attack. They would dictate the terms. They would lure Crow's men out of the crowded square, back to the one place they knew better than anyone. Back to Half Moon Wash, back to Sawyer's turf, where the water and the sand were not just elements, but weapons he had already prepared. The night did not fall. It collapsed. It descended upon Half Moon Wash like a heavy, greasy curtain, smothering the last vestiges of twilight and bringing with it a silence that felt heavy and false. The air, thick and still, held its breath, waiting. Then they came. They appeared not as men, but as a procession of malevolent spirits. 6 of them, dark figures on horseback materializing from the shadows of the eastern ridge. At their lead was Silas Crow, and in their hands they carried the devil's own light pine knot torches, freshly dipped in oil, trailing greasy black smoke and casting leaping, monstrous shadows that danced across the canyon walls. They advanced on the small ranch house, their intent as clear as the flames they carried. They had come before dawn to erase a problem, to teach a lesson written in ash. But Sawyer Hale was a man of the land. He knew that fire, like water and wind, could be herded. As the riders approached the perimeter, he moved not to his rifle, but to a large iron wheel set into the ground near the cistern. With a grunt, he spun it. A low gurgling sound followed, and then a rush of water. He had opened the sluice gate to the shallow irrigation ditches he and Goldie had spent the last 2 days digging. A network of trenches that formed a protective moat around the corral and the barn. The water, dark and cold, flowed instantly. A defensive line drawn in the earth. It would not stop the fire, but it would guide it. It would create a wet barrier, a line of steam and mud that would, with luck, keep the flames from the tinderbox of the barn and the screaming horses inside. On the low-pitched roof of the main cabin, Goldie worked just as methodically. She had hauled buckets of sand from the dry wash and mixed them with water from the rain barrel, creating a thick, gritty slurry. Now, she was spreading it with a shovel across the dried-out thatch, a desperate, practical defense against the inevitable sparks. The wet sand was heavy, but her movements were quick, fueled by a cold, clear adrenaline. The riders fanned out, a closing crescent of fire. One of Crow's men, the lanky one from the river, let out a high, whooping cry. He lit the oily rag stuffed into a glass bottle and, with a powerful underhand swing, lobbed it through the air. It sailed in a high arc and shattered against the western fence line. The explosion of flame was immediate and violent. The dry-cured pine posts, saturated with oil, went up like matchsticks. A wall of fire roared to life, casting the entire ranch yard in a terrible, flickering orange light. "It's begun," the man crowed. Sawyer didn't hesitate. He grabbed the lariat that was always coiled on his hip. He didn't run toward the man. He ran toward the fire. His arm blurred as he spun the rope. The loop widening, he threw. The lariat sailed through the smoke and flames and settled perfectly over the top of the main, burning corner post. He dug his heels into the dirt, wrapped the rope around his waist, and pulled, with a sound of protesting, splintering wood. The 10-foot post was torn from the earth. Sawyer staggered back, dragging the entire burning section of fencing with him. He didn't stop until he had hauled it 20 yards out into the open, sandy clearing, away from the other structures. He had isolated the fire, turning a spreading inferno back into a single, manageable bonfire. The move was so unexpected, so completely outside their calculations, that the riders paused, their bloodlust momentarily checked by sheer confusion. In that brief, stunned silence, Goldie acted. She scrambled down from the roof, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm. She put a small, porcelain whistle to her lips. It was a simple, delicate thing, a child's trinket, but the sound it produced was not. She blew with all the air in her lungs, a high, piercing, three-note shriek cut through the night, a sound as sharp and clear as a razor. It sliced through the crackle of the flames and the rising wind, a desperate arrow of sound aimed at the Sloan homestead. A full mile distant. There, as promised, Isla and Pax were safe, asleep in their own beds. But Mattie was awake, sitting by her window, waiting for the signal to rouse Mr. Fordyce and the others. The children were safe. The signal was the call to arms for the adults. The brief lull was over. Crow, enraged by Sawyer's tactical move, had dismounted. He understood the legal battle was lost. This was now about erasure. He was after the evidence. He stormed toward the main cabin, his face a mask of fury in the firelight. The house, he roared at his men. Burn it, find the woman, find the papers. He kicked open the cabin door and plunged into the shadows inside, expecting to find her cowering. Instead, Goldie was standing in the center of the room, blocking the doorway to the small storage area where the evidence box was kept. She was not cowering. In her hands, she held a heavy-duty broom, its handle a thick shaft of iron. She held it not like a tool for sweeping, but like a quarterstaff, her knuckles white. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, and in their dark pupils, Crow could see two tiny, perfect reflections of the flames he had brought with him. "Get out of my way." "You interfering?" Before he could finish, one of his men lunged past him, a long knife flashing in his hand, aimed at the woman who stood between his boss and his objective. He never reached her. A dark shape moved with impossible speed. Sawyer, having abandoned his rope, intercepted the man. He didn't block the knife. He moved inside the man's reach and struck him. It was not a brawler's sloppy swing. It was a single, devastatingly precise blow, a hammer blow of concentrated, cold fury, delivered to the man's solar plexus. The air left the man's lungs in a single, explosive woof. He collapsed, dropping the knife, his body folding in on itself like a wet sack. A second man, seeing his partner fall, attacked from the side. He was smarter. He uncoiled a lariat and threw it, the loop snapping open, aimed at Goldie. He intended to drag her out of the house and into the yard. The rope settled around her shoulders, and the man yanked hard, but Goldie was ready. The man's pull was met with a sudden, sharp slack. She had not been pulled off her feet. She had taken one step toward him, and in her other hand was the flash of steel. It was the dagger Sawyer had laid between them as a promise of protection. She brought the blade up in a hard, sawing motion, slicing through the taut sisal rope. The blade, which had been their vow, was now her defense. The henchman stumbled back, staring stupidly at the 6 feet of useless rope in his hand. The world dissolved into chaos. The fire, now fed by the hot, dry wind, was roaring like a freight train. The flames from the burning fence line had jumped Sawyer's ditch, catching the edge of the dry scrub. The roar was deafening, a constant, visceral bass note, sparks carried on the wind, wheeled into the black sky like a galaxy of dying stars. The eaves of the main house, where Goldie's sand slurry had been thinnest, began to smolder and then catch. Bright pinpricks of fire began to crawl up the roofline. From the corral, the horses' screams were high-pitched, a sound of pure, animal terror. They bucked and kicked against the rails, their hooves drumming the hard-packed earth in a frantic, warlike rhythm. The papers, Goldie yelled, her voice almost lost in the din. She saw Crow, having been momentarily stunned by the violence, recover. He was now rummaging through the main room, overturning the small table, kicking aside the chairs. He was looking for the evidence box, but it wasn't there. She had already moved it. "Goldie!" "No!" Sawyer shouted, as he saw her turn toward the back storage room. She didn't listen. She ripped a piece of cloth from her apron, dunked it in the water bucket by the door, and tied it fast around her face. Covering her nose and mouth, the storage room was already filling with thick, oily smoke, pouring in through the cracks in the roof. She dropped to her hands and knees and crawled into the blinding, choking haze. Smoke clawed at her throat, hot and stinging. Her eyes, even clamped shut, streamed tears. She kept one hand on the rough log wall, her only guide. She could hear the fire now, not just outside, but above her, a hungry, crackling sound in the attic space. She found the small, wooden chest, her fingers brushing its familiar iron hasp. She grabbed it, tucked it to her chest, and began to shuck backward, her back pressed to the wall. Outside, Sawyer was a man possessed. He was at the hand pump, the rhythmic clank, squeal, clank of the iron handle a desperate heartbeat beneath the fire's roar. He aimed the thin, weak stream of water at the base of the cabin walls, trying to slow the inevitable. Just as his arms began to burn with an agony of exhaustion, he heard a new sound, shouts, and not the shouts of Crow's men. Mr. Fordyce, his one powerful arm wielding a wet burlap sack like a battle axe, charged into the yard, his face a mask of righteous fury. He was followed by Mattie Sloan, Elias Thorne, and 2 other ranchers. They had come. Fordyce Sawyer yelled, "The roof, Mattie. The corral. Get the horses out." The fight turned. Fordyce and the others attacked the fire on the cabin, beating at the flames with the heavy, wet sacks, a rhythmic thwack, thwack, thwack that sent up clouds of steam and smoke. Mattie ran to the corral, her voice high and calm, speaking to the terrified horses as she unlatched the gate and drove them out toward the safety of the open plain. Crow saw his advantage, his small army, his entire plan, dissolving in an instant. His men were either on the ground or, seeing the arrival of the ranchers, were already mounting their horses to flee. He was beaten, but a cornered rat will always try to bite. With a snarl of pure hatred, he abandoned his search for the papers. He grabbed a burning brand from the ground and ran, not toward his horse, but toward the large, freestanding grain silo. It was the ranch's future, the sum of Sawyer's meager harvest, the food that would keep his animals alive through the winter. It was the one thing he couldn't lose. Crow raised the torch high, his intention clear. If he couldn't have the land, he would salt the earth. He would burn it all, starting with the evidence of their survival. "No," Sawyer roared. He abandoned the pump. There was no time to run. He looked around, his eyes falling on the tools scattered by the barn wall. He grabbed a hay hook, a long wooden handle with a sharp, curved steel point. He didn't aim to wound. He aimed to disarm, with a fluid, powerful rotation of his shoulders. He threw it. The heavy hook spun end over end, a dark crescent against the firelight. It flew true. The steel hook caught the torch just below Crow's hand, ripping it from his grasp with a violent twist. The torch flew high, arcing back toward the cabin. It sailed through the open doorway and landed in the one place that was still dry, the pile of kindling and dry tinder stacked next to the main hearth. Sparks fountained. The dry wood caught instantly. A hungry, bright orange flame licked up the interior wall, illuminating the small cabin from within. The fire was no longer just on the house. It was in it. The entire structure seemed to let out a low, shuddering groan, a gasp of a dying thing. In the sudden, terrible light from the doorway, a figure emerged, crawling, coughing, and black with soot. It was Goldie. She was clutching the evidence box to her chest. The chaos of the yard seemed to pause. The shouts of the men, the roar of the flames outside, the screams of the horses, it all receded, replaced by the intimate, terrifying crackle from their own hearth. Sawyer stood frozen, his hand still outstretched from his throw. Goldie was on her hands and knees, her head bowed, gasping for clean air. She looked up, her eyes, red-rimmed and streaming, locking with his across the burning yard. It was a quan-cock of absolute, deafening silence in the heart of the storm. In that look, 1,000 words were exchanged. The unspoken questions, "Are you alive? Are you whole?" hung between them, thick as the smoke. It was a single, shared breath. A desperate, silent acknowledgement of life, and of the words that had been left unsaid the night before, now choked in the back of their throats. The world outside was a roaring, screaming inferno. a chaos of shouts and crackling flame and the high-pitched terror of horses. But inside the small cabin, the air was suddenly still. The fire that had just been born in their own hearth crackled with a low, intimate sound, a sound of home, not destruction. The thick log walls muted the pandemonium, filtering it down to a dull, distant roar, like the sound of a faraway ocean. In this moment, the room was not just a room, it was the eye of the storm. It was the frantic, desperate, and still beating heart of the ranch. Goldie was on her hands and knees, the evidence box clutched to her chest. She was shaking, not from fear, but from the violent, electric surge of adrenaline that had carried her through the smoke. She was covered in a fine gray ash, her hair matted, her face streaked with soot and the clean lines of her tears. She coughed, a dry, racking sound that tore at her raw throat. Sawyer was in the doorway, a dark silhouette against the blazing orange of the yard. He took one step inside, and then another, his boots striking the wooden floor. The fire from the hearth lit his face, and she saw his eyes, wide and wild, fixed on her. He crossed the small space in 2 strides. He didn't reach for the box. He reached for her, his hands, broad and rough with the calluses of a lifetime of hard labor, came to rest on her upper arms. His grip was firm, a solid anchor in the spinning chaos. He didn't pull her up. He knelt in front of her, his gaze sweeping over her, searching, cataloging. "Are you whole?" he asked. His voice was a low, hoarse gravel, barely a whisper, but it cut through the din. It was not, "Are you hurt?" or "Are you safe?" It was, "Are you whole?" A question that encompassed her body, her mind, her spirit. She looked at him, at this silent, solitary man who had just thrown a hayhook to save their future, who had built a wall of water to protect his animals, and who was now kneeling in the ash at her feet. She nodded, a single, sharp movement. Words were useless. They were lodged in her throat, a thick knot of smoke and unspoken emotion. There was too much to say, and no time, and no language for it. The fear, the gratitude, the terrifying, soaring thing that had been growing between them, it was all there, in her wet, streaming eyes. So she acted. She dropped the evidence box. It thudded softly on the floor beside her, with a raw, desperate sound. She reached up, her hands fumbling, her fingers, black with soot, tangling in the rough fabric of his shirt. She grabbed his collar, pulling him down to her. She met his mouth with her own. It was not the gentle, questioning kiss of the night before. This was a kiss of brutal necessity, a desperate claiming of life in the very center of death. It was raw, and it tasted of wood smoke and pine and the salt of their own sweat. It was a kiss that said, "We are alive. We are here, right now, in this single, burning moment." He responded instantly, his mouth moving against hers, his own desperation matching hers. It was a deep, searing kiss, a search for breath, for reassurance, for the taste of life itself. His hand moved from her arm to the back of her head, his fingers tangling in her ash-stiffened hair, holding her fast as if she were the last solid thing on earth. He broke the kiss first, but only to rest his forehead against hers. They stayed like that, breathing each other's air, their lungs burning from the smoke, their hearts hammering a frantic, shared rhythm. "Goldie," he breathed, his voice a broken thing. She pulled back just enough to see his face. The firelight played in his eyes, turning them to molten gold. He was looking at her with a raw, unguarded intensity that stripped her bare. And then his hands, which had gripped her with such desperate strength, became gentle. They moved from her arms to her shoulders. And then, with a hesitation that was almost painful in its tenderness, his fingers found the laces of her corset, the simple, practical armor she had relaced just that morning. He didn't pull. His thumbs just rested on the first knot. A silent question. She didn't nod. She didn't speak. She simply released the breath she had been holding, her shoulders slumping, her body going soft in his hands. It was all the permission he needed. His hands, so large and rough, moved with a surprising, painstaking care, slowly, deliberately, as if handling a bird with a broken wing. He began to unlace her. Each pull of the string, each release of a brass eyelet, was an act of profound, deliberate care. It was not an act of passion, but of reverence. He was unwrapping a wound. He was unbinding a warrior. He looked at her face the entire time. His eyes never left hers, and in that locked gaze, there was no room for haste, no room for shame, no room for anything but a stark, terrifying, absolute trust. The firelight from the hearth danced across his face, highlighting the tense line of his jaw, the sudden vulnerability in his eyes. He worked his way down, one knot at a time. The air in the room grew thick and heavy, charged with a new kind of tension. The roar of the fire outside, the shouts of Fordyce and the others, it all faded into a distant, muffled drumbeat. The only sounds in the room were the crackle, crackle, crackle of the hearth fire, the soft shush of the laces pulling free, and the ragged sound of their breathing, which was slowly, unconsciously, beginning to sink. The corset, no longer armor, fell open. He didn't touch her. His hands rested on her waist, his thumbs against her ribs, and he just looked. He watched her take her first deep, shuddering breath as the constriction fell away. Her chemise beneath was thin, damp with sweat, and smudged with soot. He could see the frantic pulse at the base of her throat. "Tomorrow," she whispered, her voice hoarse and broken from the smoke. "We might lose everything, the ranch, the case, all of it." She raised a trembling, soot-stained hand and laid it against his jaw. "But tonight, just for this moment, we are each other's by heart." He closed his eyes at her touch, a tremor running through him. He opened them, and the last of his iron control was gone, replaced by a deep, aching tenderness. "By heart," he echoed, his voice a vow. He slid his hands from her waist, up her ribs, his calloused palms a searing, gentle friction. She shivered. He pulled her forward, gathering her against his chest, his thick, heavy duster, still smelling faintly of horse and leather and the clean cold of the night, enveloped her. He pulled her close, so close she could feel the powerful, steady beat of his heart against her own. He stood, lifting her with him as if she weighed nothing, and carried her the few steps to the thick bearskin rug that lay before the hearth. It was the rug he had been born on, the only thing of value his mother had left him. He sank to his knees, laying her down gently. The firelight washed over them, a warm, golden light that was theirs, and theirs alone. The world outside, the world of flame and violence, ceased to exist. It was beyond the door. It was outside the storm. He lay down beside her, his body a long, solid line of warmth and protection. He didn't cover her with his body. He lay facing her, propped on one elbow, his other hand finding hers, his fingers lacing with hers. A perfect, seamless fit. They looked at each other. This was the moment that had been promised. His gaze traced the line of her shoulder, where the firelight caught the fine sheen of sweat and ash. He saw the pulse at her throat, the way her breath hitched in her chest. His own breathing was just as unsteady. His hand, the one holding hers, was rock solid, a promise of unshakable strength. He leaned in and kissed her again. This kiss was different. It was slow, it was deep, it was a mapping, a learning, a silent conversation. It was a kiss of profound gratitude, of a loneliness so deep it had forgotten its own name. Now, finally, miraculously, answered. She kissed him back, her hand leaving his jaw to cup the back of his neck, her fingers sliding into his hair. Her other hand, still laced with his, gripped him tightly. This was her anchor. This was her home. The fire in the hearth snapped, a log collapsing in on itself, sending a shower of bright, cheerful sparks up the chimney. The sound, so normal, so domestic, was a benediction. Sawyer pulled back, his eyes dark with an emotion she couldn't name. It was deeper than desire. It was a kind of awe. He lowered his head, his lips brushing the damp, chaotic hair back from her temple. He kissed the soot from her cheekbone, And finally, with a tenderness that shattered the last of her defenses, he pressed a gentle, lingering kiss to her forehead, right on a smudge of ash. He pulled the edge of the thick bearskin rug up, covering her shoulder. It was a gesture of pure, unadulterated respect. The boundary had been drawn. The promise had been kept. And in that act of profound, tender restraint, he had shown her a love greater than any fire. It was in that precise, suspended moment that a new shadow fell across them. The light from the hearth was suddenly, partially eclipsed. Goldie's eyes, still locked with Sawyer's, widened. Sawyer, his body tensing like a drawn bowstring, looked over his shoulder. Silas Crow stood in the open doorway, framed against the roaring bonfire of the yard. He was breathing heavily, his face a grotesque mask of sweat, soot, and pure, unfiltered rage. He had seen them. He had seen the dagger on the floor, the discarded corset, the way they were lying together on the rug, the intimacy and the peace. He stared, his mind struggling to process the scene. He had expected to find them cowering in terror, or dead. He had expected to see his victory reflected in their fear. Instead, he saw them looking back at him, not with fear, but with a calm, united, and utterly unshakable fearlessness. He saw two people who had just passed through their own personal fire and had come out the other side, forged into something new, something he could not break. He saw, in that single, shared glance, that he had already lost. He might burn the house, he might even win the land, but he had lost. He could never touch what was between them. The spell was broken. Goldie's hand, the one in Sawyer's, squeezed, hard. "Let's go," she whispered, her voice no longer soft, but a low, hard command. The transition was immediate. It was as if a switch had been thrown. The tenderness vanished, replaced by a cold, shared purpose. Sawyer was on his feet in one fluid, powerful motion, pulling her up with him. He didn't release her hand. He pulled her behind him, his body a shield. As he reached for the iron poker by the hearth, Goldie turned her back to him, a purely practical, trusting gesture. "Lace me," she commanded. He didn't question. He grabbed the discarded corset. His hands, which moments before had been so painstakingly gentle, were now rough, efficient, and fast. He yanked the laces, pulling the stays tight with a series of hard, angry jerks. This was not about unwrapping. This was about armoring. She grabbed her own skirt, ripped a long strip from the hem, and handed it to him, never looking back. "The box. Tie it to my back. I can't carry it and fight." He secured the evidence box to her back, the new center of her gravity. She snatched his duster from the floor, shrugging it on, the heavy wool covering her completely. She grabbed the dagger from the floor and slid it back into the sheath on his belt. She turned to face the door. Her hair was a wild, tangled mess. Her face was black with soot, but her eyes, as they met Crow's, were as hard and bright as forged steel. They stood side by side, Sawyer with the poker, Goldie with the iron-handled broom. They were no longer lovers. They were a single, two-headed fighting unit, ready for the final move. Silas Crow saw the world he commanded, a world built on fear, leverage, and violence crumbling around him in a vortex of fire and defiance. His men were scattered. The townspeople were closing in, and the two people he had sought to break were now standing before him, armored in soot and resolve. Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through his rage. He stumbled backward out of the cabin doorway, his eyes darting wildly, seeking a final, desperate move, a last act of scorched earth vengeance. His gaze fell upon the grain silo, still untouched, and then to the burning torch he had dropped. He would have his fire. He would see it all burn. He lunged for the torch, scooping it from the dirt, the flames licking at his hand. He turned, his arm cocked back, ready to hurl the brand into the heart of the silo and condemn Sawyer Hale to a winter of starvation. It was in that moment that Goldie moved. She reached into the deep pocket of the duster she wore, her fingers closing around the small deerskin pouch from green maize. She did not hesitate. With a fierce cry that was half prayer, half war cry, She threw the pouch, not at Crow, but directly into the heart of the most intense fire, the raging bonfire that had once been the western fence line. The small pouch disappeared into the roaring orange flames. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, the fire convulsed. A thick, impossibly vibrant plume of smoke erupted from the center of the blaze. A column of iridescent, otherworldly blue-green that shot straight into the night sky like a signal flare. The smoke was thick with a scent of sage and lavender and something else, something ancient and wild. It did not dissipate. It held its shape, a glowing, ethereal pillar against the blackness. The entire chaotic scene froze. The ranchers beating at the flames stopped, their mouths agape. Crow, his arm still raised to throw, stared at the impossible sight, his face a mask of superstitious terror. And from the darkness at the edge of the ranch yard, a new sound arose, the thunder of approaching horses and the shouts of men. Drawn by the piercing shriek of Goldie's whistle, the second wave of the community had arrived, and at their lead, his face illuminated by the eerie blue-green light, was Judge Alvar Cardenas, a shotgun resting in the crook of his arm. He was followed by the sheriff and a dozen grim-faced, armed ranchers from Coyote Bluff. They did not need to ask where the trouble was. The spectral, glowing smoke acted as a perfect, undeniable beacon. It rose not from the burning house, but from the open yard, pointing like a divine finger directly toward the grain silo, the very place Crow was about to attack. It was as if the fire itself were giving testimony, pointing out the true target of the night's malice, the place where, as they would later find, Crow had stashed his reserve barrels of pine tar and oil-soaked straw, ready for the final act of destruction. The arrival of the law, of the judge himself, broke Crow's nerve completely. He dropped the torch. His final gambit was lost. He was a cornered animal, and now Goldie, the woman he had dismissed, disgraced, and tried to destroy, stepped out of the cabin and into the firelight to deliver the killing blow. She was no longer just a clerk. She was a prosecutor, and the entire ranch yard was her courtroom. With Sawyer at her side, she walked to the evidence box, which lay where she had dropped it. She untied the scorched ropes that bound it to her back and threw open the lid before the assembled, silent crowd. "This is the law, Mr. Crow," she shouted, her voice ringing with a power no one there had ever heard from her before. She pulled out the first document, the certified telegraph from Jeb Whitlow, showing the 7 secret land purchases by your phantom agent, Raven 13. She threw it to the ground at the judge's feet, the forged foreclosure notice, with the counterfeit seal, Scrip Homestead 47B. It landed atop the first, the invoice for the pine tar and quicklime you tried to pin on a widow, Mattie Sloan. Another paper fluttered down, the blacksmith's staple, with his own private mark, stolen from his forge to sabotage Mr. Hale's fences. The small piece of metal clinked against the hard dirt. "The evidence is all here," she finished, her voice dropping but losing none of its intensity, her gaze sweeping across the faces of her neighbors. "And the evidence does not lie." Crow let out a strangled, desperate roar. He made a final, foolish move, not to fight, but to flee. He turned to run for his horse. He took 2 steps before something cracked through the air like a pistol shot. It was not a bullet. It was the sound of braided leather. Sawyer, moving with a fluid, deadly grace, had snatched a long rein from a discarded harness on the ground. He did not draw his gun. He used the tool of his trade. With a flick of his wrist, he sent the rein snaking through the air. The leather tip wrapped itself with perfect, biting accuracy around Crow's right ankle. Sawyer yanked hard. Crow's legs were pulled out from under him. He hit the ground with a heavy, ignominious thud, his face plowing into the red dirt he had tried to steal. Before he could even think to rise, Sawyer was on him, not with a boot or a fist, but with a cold, controlled expertise. He looped the rein around Crow's wrists, binding them behind his back with a series of swift, non-negotiable knots, the same knots he would use to subdue a wild, unbroken stallion. He brought the man to his knees, utterly and completely mastered, not by a killer, but by a rancher. Judge Cardenas stepped forward, his face like carved stone in the firelight. He looked down at the kneeling, defeated man, Silas Crow. The judge's voice boomed. A final, official verdict. By the authority of this court, I am placing you under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, for the willful destruction of property, for arson, and for the attempted intimidation of a legal proceeding. Sheriff, take this man into custody. The sheriff and 2 deputies hauled Crow to his feet. The fight was gone from him, replaced by a sullen, venomous rage. "This isn't over," he screamed, his voice shrill. "You think this little kangaroo court means anything? I'll be out by morning. My lawyers will bury this territory in appeals. I will be back." He was still shouting as they dragged him away. A ragged, triumphant cheer went up from the assembled ranchers. They had won, but the true peak of the victory, the final, perfect act of revenge, was not the sound of the crowd. It was the quiet, deliberate act that followed. Goldie turned to the judge, who was watching her with an expression of profound respect. "Your Honor," she said, her voice now calm and steady, "before you go, there is one last piece of business." She produced a final, clean sheet of paper from the evidence box. It was a blank petition for temporary land use preservation, a legal document that would formally protect Sawyer's claim from any further challenges until a full territorial hearing could be held. With a piece of charcoal, in the flickering light of the fire that had been meant to destroy them, she filled it out. Then, using the top of the evidence box as her desk, under the watchful eyes of the entire community, she signed her name at the bottom as the acting legal petitioner. She passed it to the judge, who countersigned it with a flourish, his signature a bold, official seal on their victory. She had not just saved his ranch. She had enshrined its safety in the very law Crow had sought to twist. As the crowd began to disperse, talking in excited, exhausted voices, dousing the last of the flames, Sawyer turned to Goldie. They stood alone in a small circle of quiet amidst the lingering smoke and the first pale hint of dawn. He looked at the ranch, at the scorched but standing cabin, at the saved silo, at the community that had come to their aid. Then he looked at her. He said only one thing, his voice low and certain, a promise as solid as a foundation post. "Stay," he said. "Not for the land. For the home." Goldie looked up at him, at his strong, soot-stained face. Her own hand, which had been trembling all night, rose and came to rest flat against his chest, right over his powerful, steady heart. She could feel its solid, living beat against her palm, and she nodded. The camera cuts. The interior of the cabin, the fire in the hearth crackles, a warm, domestic sound. Goldie is leaning her forehead against Sawyer's chest, her eyes closed. The corset she wears is neatly laced, no longer a symbol of restriction, but of a choice, a piece of armor voluntarily worn. Quick cuts, like flashes of memory. The orphan herd of horses, their shapes dark against a brilliant sunrise orange sky. The community Fordyce, Maddie, Elias working together, their faces tired but smiling, beating out the last of the embers. The sharp, definitive sound of Judge Cardenas's wooden gavel striking a desk. A sound of finality, a full stop to Silas Crow's reign. The final image, Sawyer and Goldie stand before the hearth. The firelight flickers. He takes a thin, soft strip of braided leather, a promise ring, a tradition among horsemen, and gently, carefully, ties it around her wrist. It is not a shackle, it is a bond. They don't kiss. They simply look at each other, their eyes locking in a silent, profound understanding. The fire crackles. The screen fades to black. Their story is just beginning. Thank you so much for listening to this Wild West tale. Where in the world are you tuning in from? Let us know in the comments below. We'd love to connect and hear your thoughts on Goldie and Sawyer's story. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. And to help us share these stories with even more people, consider giving that hype button a press. It truly helps us bring the spirit of the Old West to listeners everywhere.